Welcome, dear listener. The last golden days of summer linger softly over St. Mary Mead. The air is warm, carrying the scent of ripening apples and freshly cut grass, while somewhere in the distance, laughter drifts from the church fête still bustling beyond the green. Miss Marple sits quietly by her garden gate, knitting resting in her lap, the rhythmic click of needles mingling with the hum of bees. All around her, the village breathes in slow contentment. Children chase one another by the hedgerows, and the vicar's bell tolls faintly across the hills. Yet beneath the stillness, something feels different today, like the pause before a story changes direction. A soft unease lingers in the air, too faint for words, but impossible to ignore. So, where are you listening from tonight? Wherever you are, settle in. The last days of summer are about to take a darker turn. The fête at the vicarage glowed with the gentle charm of late summer. Bunting fluttered above the green. Tables bowed under the weight of sponge cakes and jams, and the air was alive with laughter and the faint rustle of silk dresses. Miss Marple, seated near the tea tent, watched it all with quiet fondness. Her gaze paused on Mrs. Dalrymple, newly returned from abroad, who carried a parasol though the sky was dull and gray. Nearby, young Peter Halley remarked that the mill pond had dried up far too soon this year. Odd, that, he said, and wandered off whistling. By dusk, the fête was fading into twilight. Miss Marple walked home, shawl drawn close, the scent of rain in the air. Then a cry, sharp and sudden, a maid's voice, trembling from the Dalrymple house. "She won't wake up." Lanterns flared. Roses perfumed the night. Chapter 1. The Last Fête of Summer. The afternoon sun hung low, brushing the meadows with a honeyed light. Beneath the apple trees that framed the vicarage garden, the village fête unfolded in all its gentle charm. The brass band, slightly off-key but cheerful, played a waltz that mingled with the hum of chatter and the soft clatter of teacups. Tables lined with sponge cakes, jams, and preserves gleamed under the bunting, while the scent of crushed grass and roses drifted lazily through the air. It was the kind of afternoon that seemed made to be remembered. An end-of-summer dream stitched with ribbons, laughter, and secrets no one yet suspected. Miss Marple sat near the edge of the green, her chair placed perfectly to observe without being noticed. She knitted with steady rhythm, her eyes missing nothing. She watched Mrs. Price argue over the last slice of Victoria's sponge, and Mr. Ellison trip over his own enthusiasm at the coconut shy. But amid all the harmless nonsense, one figure seemed quietly apart. Mrs. Dalrymple, elegant in pale gray, stood near the tea tent, her fingers tightening on her parasol. Her smile was too careful, her laughter too thin. Every few minutes she glanced toward the road leading out of the village, as though waiting for someone or dreading that they might appear. Miss Marple noticed how the woman's eyes flicked toward the mill path, the same one young Peter Halley had wandered earlier. The raffle began, prizes gleaming beneath the tent lights. A fruit basket, a silver brooch, a tin of biscuits nobody really wanted, but everyone pretended to. The vicar read names with theatrical delight, pausing for the laughter that always followed his jokes. Yet as Miss Marple looked up, she saw that Mrs. Dalrymple's place was empty. Her parasol leaned abandoned against a chair, fluttering slightly in the soft wind. People drifted past, unbothered, absorbed in their chatter. But Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the narrow lane beyond the hedgerow. She thought she saw a movement, a shadow slipping between the trees, the faintest sound of gravel underfoot. Perhaps it was nothing, she told herself, though her needles paused mid-stitch. The brass band struck a brighter tune, but somehow the air felt heavier, as if the day itself had changed its mood. She rose to fetch another cup of tea, stopping to greet the vicar's wife, who was wresting a jam jar from a small child's determined hands. "Lovely weather for the fête," Miss Marple said mildly. "Though it seems a little too still, doesn't it?" The vicar's wife laughed politely, not noticing the undertone. She was too busy declaring the raffle a success. By the time the band reached its final note, clouds had begun to gather. The breeze rustled the apple branches, scattering a few leaves like a quiet signal of change. Miss Marple looked toward the gate again, where Mrs. Dalrymple's parasol still waited, an empty sentinel beneath the trees. Somewhere down the lane, a bird startled from the hedge, wings flapping against the deepening hush. Why, Miss Marple wondered, would a woman leave the fête before her name was called for the raffle, when winning seemed so very important to her earlier that day? And if she did leave in haste, who had been waiting just beyond the orchard, unseen by all except perhaps one quiet old lady who noticed everything? The last chords of the waltz faded, leaving behind a silence that seemed to hum with its own question. By evening, the laughter and color of the fête had melted into quiet. The green lay empty, trampled grass glistening faintly with dew as the last of the bunting fluttered half loose in the rising wind. A few stray napkins drifted across the lawn like pale ghosts of the afternoon. Miss Marple, now home and settled beside her lamp, listened to the first low grumble of thunder rolling over the hills. The storm had been promised all day, she thought. It was only keeping its appointment. Outside, the village sank into stillness. Even the sparrows had vanished from the hedges. Miss Marple sipped her tea, letting her thoughts wander to Mrs. Dalrymple and her sudden disappearance before the raffle's end. Perhaps she'd felt unwell, or perhaps something else had drawn her away, something she hadn't wished to share. The old clock on the mantel chimed 8, the sound soft and measured. It was then she heard it, quick, uneven footsteps on a lane outside her gate. She rose quietly, moving to the window. The lamplight glowed against the misted glass. Through it, she saw a figure, small, hurried, slipping along the hedge toward the Dalrymple house. The shape vanished into the dark before she could make out more than the sway of a coat and the gleam of wet shoes catching the light. The storm deepened. A gust of wind scattered petals from her rose bushes, sending them tumbling across the path. A few minutes later came the first drops of rain, heavy and cold against the panes. Miss Marple drew her shawl closer and sat again, listening to the rhythmic patter. The village was wrapped in silence now, save for the wind's slow breathing and the distant rattle of shutters. She thought of the fête, the laughter, the music, and how swiftly such noise could turn into stillness. Then, faintly, from the direction of the Dalrymple house, came a sound that pierced the quiet like a knife, a woman's scream. It rose once, high and desperate, then broke into sobs. Miss Marple froze, teacup trembling in her hand. Another sound followed, the slam of a door, the hurried call of voices, the scrape of someone running for help. The storm answered with a bright flash of lightning, widening the lane for an instant. Within half an hour, Dr. Haydock's motorcar rattled past, its headlights slicing through the rain. Villagers, drawn by instinct, gathered at their windows, curtains twitching. Whispers began even before anyone knew the truth. A fainting spell, perhaps, a fall. By the time the doctor's knock echoed against the door, speculation had already rooted itself deep. But when the maid appeared in the doorway, pale and shaking, her eyes wide with horror, the truth needed no words. Mrs. Dalrymple was dead. The doctor could find no wound, no mark, no sign of struggle. She had simply ceased, as if the breath had gone out of her in silence, leaving behind only the scent of lavender and the faint impression of a teacup by her bed. Miss Marple stood at her gate beneath the flickering lamp, rain tapping gently on her shawl. Death, she thought, seldom arrives without reason, though reason often hides itself well. The storm passed over, muting the village in its wake. Behind drawn curtains, whispers began to bloom like night flowers, of curses, of heartache, of sins returned. And somewhere in that soft, uneasy quiet, Miss Marple's keen mind began to turn. Chapter 2, Rumors and Rosaries. Morning crept over St. Mary Mead in a hush of pale gold and lingering mist. The storm had washed the world clean, leaving the hedgerows dripping and the cobblestones shining faintly in the early light. But peace, Miss Marple thought, was a fragile illusion. Beneath the calm lay the tremor of curiosity, the kind that stirred awake before the church bell rang 8. By the time she stepped out to fetch her morning milk, the village had already begun to hum. Mrs. Price Ridley was standing at her gate, shawl pulled tight, whispering fiercely to Miss Hartnell, who was pretending not to listen while quite clearly doing nothing else. Mr. Johnson, the postmaster, sorted letters with theatrical solemnity, and even the paperboy looked as though he were carrying a great secret along with the Daily Chronicle. Such a sad business, Mrs. Price Ridley said as soon as Miss Marple approached, lowering her voice but not nearly enough. Perfectly healthy one day, and gone the next. Heart, they say. Though if you ask me, there was always something peculiar about that woman. Indeed, said Miss Marple mildly, adjusting her basket. Oh yes, Mrs. Price Ridley leaned closer. Dismissed her cook not 3 days ago. Imagine, right before the fête. And now the poor creature's in pieces, crying her eyes out at the grocer's. Some say Mrs. Dalrymple had taken to locking her writing desk, too. Nothing good ever comes of secrets, Miss Marple, as I always say. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Quite so. Inside the vicarage, the morning's calm was punctuated by the clatter of cups and the low murmur of conversation. The vicar's wife, ever practical in times of distress, had gathered a few ladies to pray for poor Mrs. Dalrymple's soul, though in truth prayer and gossip tended to share the same tablecloth in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple took a seat by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly as she listened. Words drifted like petals. Poisoned tea, a quarrel, a letter. I heard from my cousin, she helps with the cleaning there, that Mrs. Dalrymple received a letter that very morning, Mrs. Clements said, lowering her voice dramatically. Plain paper, no return address. Whatever it said, it made her quite pale. Miss Hartnell gasped. A threatening letter? Oh, I wouldn't say that. Mrs. Clements stirred her tea thoughtfully, but she was upset enough to spill her cup. And that's not like her. She was always so graceful, so precise. Miss Marple kept her eyes on her knitting, her fingers steady though her thoughts were not. An unsigned letter, a dismissed cook, a woman preoccupied at a fête, glancing toward the road. Such details seldom floated separately. Sooner or later, they joined. The vicar entered then, solemn and grave. Dr. Haydock believes it was the heart, he said gently. A sudden failure. She was alone when it happened. Alone, Miss Marple repeated softly. He nodded. The maid had gone down to fetch more hot water. When she returned, well, it was over. A murmur rippled through the room, relief mixed with disappointment. A natural death was so much less interesting. But Miss Marple's gaze had turned distant. "And the letter?" she asked, as though to herself. "Oh, the inspector has it," said the vicar's wife. "Found torn in half upon her desk. Nothing legible, save for a few words, 'Remember' and 'Truth.' Dreadful thing, really." Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly. "Truth," she murmured. It has a way of finding its moment, doesn't it? As she walked home through the damp lanes, she passed the Dalrymple gate. It stood slightly ajar, the gravel path beyond speckled with fallen petals from the overgrown rose bushes. The house loomed quiet, its curtains drawn. Yet even from the road, Miss Marple could sense it, the residue of unease that clings to places where questions have yet to be answered. Somewhere inside that silence, she thought, was the reason Mrs. Dalrymple had died. And perhaps, before the roses faded, the truth would begin to show itself. Rain threatened again by afternoon, a pale drizzle that softened the air and turned the village lanes to shining ribbons. Miss Marple had just settled by the hearth with her mending when a timid knock came at her door. Opening it, she found the Dalrymples' maid, eyes red, apron crumpled, and fingers twisting the corner of a handkerchief. "Oh, Miss Marple," the girl began, voice trembling. "I shouldn't have come, but I didn't know what else to do." "Come in, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, ushering her toward the fire. "A cup of tea first, I think." The girl nodded gratefully. When warmth and comfort had steadied her, she drew something from her pocket, a small, crumpled piece of paper torn jaggedly across the middle. "I found it, miss, in the bin by the writing desk. The inspector said to leave things be, but it didn't seem right somehow." Miss Marple smoothed the paper carefully on her lap. The handwriting was unsteady, hurried, and only one sentence remained intact. "It will all come out soon." There was no name, no date, no signature, just that single unsettling promise. "Did you notice anything strange yesterday?" Miss Marple asked. The girl hesitated, only that she seemed frightened. She kept touching the locket she always wore, as if to make sure it was still there. "Gold, it was, with a little rose carved in the center. But it's gone now, miss. I saw her wearing it at the fête, and when they found her, well, it wasn't about her neck anymore." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "The locket was missing?" "Yes, miss. And the drawer where she kept her jewelry, open. But nothing else taken, not even the silver watch." After the girl left, Miss Marple took her umbrella and walked slowly up the lane to the Dalrymple house. The inspector was gone for the day. Only a constable lingered by the gate, nodding respectfully as she passed. Inside, the house carried that peculiar stillness of places recently touched by tragedy. Mrs. Dalrymple's sitting room was neat, almost painfully so. A half-knitted shawl lay folded on the arm of a chair. Beside it, a cup of tea gone cold. The faint scent of lavender drifted through the air, her favorite perfume, Miss Marple recalled, but mingled now with something older, the dry sweetness of wilted flowers. She paused by the writing desk. Ink stains freckled the blotter, and the wastebasket beneath still held scraps of torn paper. None fit the piece the maid had brought. On the dresser stood a small jewelry box, its velvet interior slightly askew where one item had clearly been removed. A missing locket, a torn letter, and a woman who had looked over her shoulder all through the fête. Miss Marple leaned closer to the open drawer, noticing a faint ring in the dust, where the locket must once have rested. As she straightened, something glinted beneath the dresser, a loose thread of gold. Bending, she retrieved it carefully, a broken clasp, delicate and finely made. It might have snapped when someone pulled too quickly, or perhaps when the chain was torn away in haste. Outside, thunder rumbled softly across the fields. Miss Marple replaced the clasp in her handkerchief, her expression unreadable. The lavender fragrance seemed stronger now, clinging to her sleeves as if the room itself refused to let go of its secret. Back home, she laid the torn note beside the clasp on her table. "It will all come out soon," she murmured. "So it always does." Then she added, almost fondly, "But one must be patient and notice the small things." For in St. Mary Mead, it was always the smallest things that told the truest stories. Chapter 3. The Visitor from London. It was the kind of gray morning that made even the roses seem tired. Mist clung to the hedgerows, softening every edge of St. Mary Mead into something half-remembered. The milk cart rattled by. The postman's whistle echoed faintly, and life seemed to resume its gentle rhythm after the shock of Mrs. Dalrymple's passing. But by mid-morning, a new ripple passed through the calm. A motor car, sleek and unfamiliar, stopped at the Green Man Inn. From her garden gate, Miss Marple saw the man step out, a tall figure in a gray hat, his overcoat sharply pressed, shoes polished to a city shine. He paused a moment, surveying the village with the quick, measuring glance of someone who preferred order and discretion. Then, as though aware of unseen eyes, he lifted his hat briefly to no one in particular and went inside. By noon, the gossip had already begun to circulate. He was a solicitor from London, someone connected to Mrs. Dalrymple's affairs. Mrs. Price from the post office said he'd asked after the vicarage. Mr. Simmons, who ran the inn, told the grocer that the man had reserved his room for 2 nights, possibly 3. Miss Hartnell, of course, added with satisfaction that he'd ordered tea without sugar. Londoners never trust village water. Miss Marple, knitting in her garden, smiled faintly at their talk, but listened closely all the same. The details people overlooked were often the most useful ones. Later that afternoon, as she took her customary walk, she passed by the churchyard and caught sight of the man again, this time speaking quietly with the vicar near the lych gate. His voice carried just enough for her to hear a few words. Yes, a recent change to the will. Hand-delivered, if I'm not mistaken. Unusual, but she was most insistent. Miss Marple's steps slowed. A new will? Only a week ago. That was curious indeed. Mrs. Dalrymple had returned from abroad barely a fortnight past. Why the sudden urgency to alter her affairs? She moved on before they noticed her, her expression mild, but her thoughts far from it. That evening, she saw him again. Dusk was falling, the mist returning to gather in the hollows, when she glimpsed the solicitor, his gray hat distinct even in the dimming light, walking toward the old mill lane. The pond there had nearly dried to a shallow hollow of cracked mud and weeds. No one went there much since the water had gone, and yet he lingered, staring into it as though searching for something lost. Miss Marple watched from a distance, unseen behind a lilac hedge. He stooped once, as though picking something up, then pocketed it quickly before turning back toward the road. At supper, the talk around the village was all about him. Some said he was kind, others thought him cold. Mrs. Price claimed he'd asked about the Dalrymple maid's references. The vicar had confirmed his papers were in order. But Miss Marple noticed how each tale contradicted the next, how his politeness seemed to conceal, not reveal. That night, the wind rose again, rattling the windows of the cottages. Miss Marple sat at her writing table, her teacup cooling beside her notes. A new will, a missing locket, a letter promising that it will all come out soon. And now a man from London who seemed far too interested in a dried-up pond. She laid down her pen, thoughtful. People always hide things where they think no one will look, she murmured. And yet they forget. Nothing stays hidden forever in a village. Outside, the church bell tolled softly, marking the hour. Somewhere near the mill, an owl called once and fell silent. In that stillness, Miss Marple felt the faint stirrings of truth, like something moving just beneath the surface, waiting for the right eyes to see. The next morning dawned clearer, sunlight falling in long, patient stripes across the vicarage garden. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and cut grass, and Miss Marple thought it a fine morning for visiting. She brought along a small basket of scones, "For the Reverend," she said modestly, and found Mrs. Clement already arranging dahlias in a blue vase on the table. "How kind of you, Miss Marple," said Mrs. Clement warmly. "Do sit down. I was just about to make tea. My word, what a week it's been. Poor Mrs. Dalrymple. It hardly seems real." Miss Marple smiled gently, removing her gloves. "Indeed, dear. One day all the village is discussing sponge cakes and parish raffles, and the next," she let the sentence trail off delicately. Mrs. Clement sighed. "Everyone has a theory, of course. Some say heart trouble, others something dreadful like poison. And now, this gentleman from London. What must he think of us all?" Miss Marple accepted her cup of tea, stirring it slowly. "He calls himself a solicitor, I hear. And quite right, I dare say." Mrs. Dalrymple was a woman of means. "Yes," Mrs. Clement said thoughtfully, "though I always wondered just how much of that fortune truly remained. The late Mr. Dalrymple's affairs were complicated." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "So I have heard." Mrs. Clement lowered her voice, glancing toward the open window as though the roses themselves might be listening. "There were whispers, about 10 years ago before he died. Something to do with missing funds from a charity in London. Nothing proven, of course, but it was said she settled certain accounts very quietly afterward. They went abroad soon after that. Italy, I think." "Ah," said Miss Marple, sipping her tea. "And now she returns to England, alone, and alters her will within a week. Quite the coincidence, wouldn't you say?" Mrs. Clement nodded gravely. "Do you suppose she feared something? Or someone?" Miss Marple folded her napkin neatly. "Fear takes many forms, dear. Sometimes it's the past that frightens us most, especially when we believe we've buried it well." They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the faint ticking of the clock and the cooing of a pigeon outside. Then Mrs. Clement leaned forward, unable to resist. "The solicitor, Mr. Finch, was it? Seems very nervous. The Reverend says his hand shook when he signed the visitor's register. Not quite what one expects from a London man of law." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Perhaps he has his reasons. Some men tremble because they fear scandal, others because they are part of it." Mrs. Clement blushed faintly at the boldness of the remark, but she smiled nonetheless. "You always do have a way of seeing things, Miss Marple." "Oh, my dear, one merely observes. People reveal much over tea. Nerves, guilt, or affection, it all comes out between the sugar bowl and the second cup." As she left the vicarage, the sunlight had begun to fade again, the promise of another storm gathering at the edges of the sky. Miss Marple walked slowly down the lane, her mind tracing connections. A letter that warned, it will all come out soon. A solicitor arriving with a changed will. A missing locket and an old scandal about lost funds. Unfinished business, she murmured. Yes, that does seem to fit rather well. In the distance, the bell from the Green Man and chimed faintly, marking the hour. Perhaps Mr. Finch was there again, drinking his tea with trembling hands and glancing toward the mill pond, where mud dried over secrets better left undisturbed. And Miss Marple, walking home beneath the swaying apple trees, felt that the past was beginning, ever so quietly, to whisper back. Chapter 4. Shadows Under Lamplight. The next morning dawned soft and golden, but by mid-afternoon, the sun had baked the fields to a sleepy warmth. The hum of bees filled the hedgerows, and the village children, restless from their lessons, had gone exploring near the old mill pond. The water had long since receded, leaving behind a shallow hollow of cracked mud, reeds, and glistening puddles. It was there, amid laughter and the squelch of boots, that a small cry went up. Look, something shiny. Within the hour, half the children had run shrieking through the lanes to announce their discovery. By the time Miss Marple arrived, summoned by the vicar's wife, who had heard the news while buying bread. A small group had gathered near the pond's edge. The constable stood awkwardly nearby, hat in hand, while a little girl in plaits pointed toward the mud. "There, miss," she said proudly. "We found it stuck under the reeds." Miss Marple leaned down, her eyes narrowing behind her spectacles. Resting in the constable's palm was a small silver chain, tarnished but unmistakably fine. A locket, oval in shape, its surface engraved with a delicate rose. She recognized it instantly. "Mrs. Dalrymple's," she said softly. "How very interesting." The constable shifted uneasily. "Could have washed down here from the lane, ma'am. There's been a good bit of rain." "Possibly," said Miss Marple, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Or possibly not." She took the locket in her gloved hand, feeling the faint grit of dried mud along the hinge. The clasp was broken, the same clean snap she'd noticed on the gold fragment found in the house. "May I?" she asked. The constable nodded, and she pressed the latch open with care. Inside lay a faded photograph, the edges curled with age. The image was faint but clear enough. A man's face, serious and distinguished, with neatly parted hair and the look of someone accustomed to command. "Do you know him, miss?" the constable asked. Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "No, but I think Mrs. Dalrymple did, and quite well by the look of it." The children, sensing the solemnity of the moment, grew quiet. Miss Marple closed the locket gently and straightened, her expression thoughtful. "If you be so kind as to see that it's properly noted," she said to the constable, "I dare say this will prove illuminating." Back at her cottage, she cleaned the locket carefully and studied the photograph again under the lamplight. There was something peculiar about the image, a faint watermark along the edge, the sort used by a London photographer more than a decade ago. She remembered that Mrs. Dalrymple had lived in London once, before her husband's health failed. Perhaps this man belonged to that vanished chapter of her life. Still, something tugged at Miss Marple's mind. The locket had not simply fallen. It had been taken, perhaps hidden. Why else would it turn up at the very pond where the mysterious solicitor had been seen lingering 2 evenings before? And why had he shown such interest in the place at all? She reached for a notebook, writing a few careful lines. The man in the photograph, unknown to village. Hidden item, disposed of or recovered in haste. Connection to will? To letter? Outside, twilight had begun to fall. The lamplighter made his slow way down the street, tapping each glass globe into a soft golden glow. Miss Marple watched him for a while, the locket resting beside her teacup. Secrets, she thought, have a strange habit of rising to the surface, especially when the world believes them buried. Somewhere beyond the hedge, a nightjar called, its cry threading through the still air like an echo of the past. Miss Marple closed the locket one final time, her eyes calm but bright with quiet certainty. "The dead," she murmured, "are never quite finished speaking." Evening had deepened into a quiet, amber glow when Miss Marple was invited to the vicarage once more. The Reverend Clement had sent word through his wife, a small matter of conscience, the note had said. She found him seated in his study, the curtains drawn, the lamplight flickering across rows of well-thumbed books, and a faint smell of pipe smoke lingering in the air. He looked older than usual, the lines at his temples more pronounced. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said softly, rising to greet her. "Thank you for coming. I thought perhaps I might speak to you, unofficially as it were." "Of course, my dear Reverend," she said, taking the chair opposite his desk. "Unofficial conversations are often the most useful kind." He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You've heard, I suppose, of Mrs. Dalrymple's visits to me before she died?" "Only that she called once or twice," Miss Marple replied gently. The village says she sought comfort, but that, of course, the village always says. The vicar nodded, fingers clasped tightly. It's true. She came the week before her death. She was greatly troubled, though not ill, at least not physically. She spoke of regret, something long past, but never at rest. She said she had come to make it right, though I could not persuade her to say precisely what that meant. Miss Marple listened without interrupting, her knitting needles moving softly in her lap. And you have no idea to what she referred? He hesitated. I have suspicions, but as you know, there are matters I am bound not to disclose. She nodded understandingly. Of course, the seal of your office is not one to break lightly. He sighed deeply, staring into the lamplight. What I can tell you is this. She seemed afraid of something, or perhaps someone. She mentioned that a letter might soon reach me, one that would explain everything. It never came. Miss Marple looked thoughtful. A letter never sent, perhaps intercepted, or perhaps hidden. Perhaps, the vicar said quietly. She spoke, too, of forgiveness. Not divine forgiveness, mind you, but that of a particular person. I believe she meant to seek someone out, but she ran out of time. There was a pause, filled only by the soft ticking of the clock. Then Miss Marple said, "You seem troubled yourself, Reverend. May I ask, does this have anything to do with young Mr. Halley?" He blinked, startled. "Why, what makes you ask that?" "Oh, nothing specific," Miss Marple said mildly. "Only that you've not mentioned him, though you usually speak fondly of the lad. And he was near the pond that afternoon, was he not? I believe he was the one who remarked how early it had dried up." The vicar's hands tightened on his teacup. "Peter Halley is a good boy," he said too quickly. "Headstrong, perhaps, but good. I would not have his name mixed in a gossip." "Quite right," said Miss Marple, her tone serene. "And yet gossip is often merely truth wearing its oldest coat." He looked away, eyes fixed on the fire. "Mrs. Dalrymple asked me to visit the Halley boy, you know. She said he reminded her of someone she had wronged. I didn't understand it at the time." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "And now you think you do." He said nothing, only stared at the dying fire, its glow fading into ash. When she rose to leave, the vicar accompanied her to the door, his voice low. "Whatever this is, Miss Marple," he said, "I fear it began long before she came back to St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple gave him a kind, steady look. "My dear Reverend, most tragedies do." Outside, the church bell struck 9, each chime soft as a heartbeat. Miss Marple drew her shawl closer and walked home beneath the lamplight, her mind turning over the vicar's words. A confession unspoken, a boy connected by memory, and a woman seeking forgiveness too late. Some sins, she thought, were buried not in the earth, but in the heart, and those always found their way to the surface in time. Chapter 5. The Storm Breaks. Rain came hard and sudden that afternoon, drumming against the cottage panes and turning the garden paths to mud. Miss Marple, seated by the window with her notebook, found the storm oddly comforting. "Weather," she murmured, "has a way of washing the truth to the surface, if one only looks where the puddles form." The event of the fête, now nearly a week past, returned to her mind with unwelcome clarity. The cheerful bunting, the laughter, the fortune-teller's tent, and then the terrible discovery at Rose Cottage the next morning. Mrs. Dalrymple, dead in her bed. The maid insisting she'd retired early. Everything so tidy, too tidy. Now, as thunder rolled across the hills, Miss Marple reviewed her notes. 9 p.m. The maid, Elsie, claimed she had taken her mistress's tray upstairs and found her quite ready for sleep. Curtains drawn, lavender scent strong in the room. 9:15. Elsie says she locked up and went to her own quarters above the kitchen. She heard nothing until morning. But then there was Mrs. Prowse, the neighbor who had come to return a borrowed book. She'd passed the cottage around 11:30 on her way home from the fate's cleanup. There was a light still burning upstairs, she'd said. I remember thinking how odd it was for Mrs. Dalrymple to be awake so late. She was particular about her rest. Miss Marple tapped her pencil against the paper. Between 9 and 11:30, she whispered, 2.5 hours unaccounted for. She rose, fetched her shawl, and went to see Elsie. The maid opened the door, pale and nervous. "Oh, Miss Marple, such dreadful weather. You'll be soaked." "Never mind that, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly, stepping in. "I've just a few more questions about that evening. I know it's tiresome, but little things matter so much in cases like this." Elsie twisted her hands in her apron. "I've told the police everything. I'm sure you have. But they often overlook what seems too small to mention. For instance, did you see anyone about the garden that night?" The maid hesitated. "No one. Well, except maybe I thought I heard voices just before I went upstairs. But the wind was high, and it might have been the fate crowd still going home." "Voices, you say?" "Yes, ma'am. One was a man's voice, low. The other, I can't be sure." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And when you brought in the tray, did Mrs. Dalrymple seem nervous?" "She was distracted, like she was waiting for something. She even asked me to leave the window open a crack, said she liked the air. But, ma'am, it was such a chill night." "Quite," said Miss Marple softly. "And the next morning, the window was shut tight." Elsie blinked. "Why, yes, it was. I hadn't noticed till now." Miss Marple looked around the room thoughtfully. "I should think someone closed it. From the inside, or perhaps the outside." The maid's face drained of color. "Oh, don't say that, ma'am." Miss Marple gave her a gentle smile. "Don't be frightened, child. Truth, like rain, often seems more dreadful than it is at first." When Miss Marple left Rose Cottage, the rain had softened to a fine mist. She walked slowly toward the lane where Mrs. Prowse lived, her mind ticking over details. Mrs. Dalrymple had been alive at 9. The light seen at 11:30 meant she, or someone, was awake. But who had entered the cottage? The door had been bolted in the morning, the windows locked. Unless... She paused beneath a flickering lamp. The side door, the one by the kitchen. The latch could be lifted with a knife blade, a trick known to any clever village boy. And there had been a boy, Peter Halley. He'd been seen near the cottage that evening, helping to pack up the fate tents. His excuse, returning the borrowed hammer, had seemed harmless enough. But Miss Marple, who had seen far too many harmless boys grow into dangerous men, knew better than to dismiss coincidence. By the time she reached home, her notebook was dotted with raindrops, the ink bleeding faintly. She set it to dry beside the fire and poured herself a cup of tea. "The missing hours," she murmured. "They always tell the story, once one knows where to listen." Outside, lightning cracked across the fields and thunder shook the rafters. Somewhere beyond the rain, a truth was stirring, ready at last to step out into the light. Dr. Haydock stood in the drawing room, his spectacles sliding down his nose, the rain still glistening on his coat. "No definite poison," he said, tapping the paper in his hand. "But there are traces, minute but present, of something akin to valerian, perhaps mixed with digitalis, either taken intentionally or administered by someone she trusted." Miss Marple, seated neatly by the fire, gave a soft sigh. "Valerian," she murmured, "a comfort for troubled sleep, and digitalis for the heart. Quite ordinary in their way, and quite fatal if offered without care." The doctor frowned. "I not call it murder yet. Perhaps she dosed herself wrongly. A widow, living alone, nerves unsettled. "You know how these things go." "Oh, yes," said Miss Marple. "Indeed I do. But I've also known the difference between a hand that comforts and one that guides too firmly toward the grave." Dr. Haydock gave her a quick glance. He had long since learned that Miss Marple's tone, mild as milk, often carried the weight of quiet suspicion. He folded the report, slid it into his case, and added, "I'll have the coroner informed. Officially, we'll call it heart failure pending further results." "And unofficially?" she asked. "Unofficially," he said, buttoning his coat, "I'd keep my eye on anyone who brewed her tea." When he had gone, the room fell back into its hush. The faint tick of the clock mingled with the whisper of rain. Miss Marple stared into the fire, her needles motionless in her lap. Kindness. The word returned to her mind. How many times had she seen cruelty wrapped in soft manners? A neighbor who helped too eagerly, a friend who watched over the lonely. In her experience, the truly dangerous were never the loud or the angry. They were the ones who smiled and meant it every time. She thought of Mrs. Dalrymple's maid, the nervous girl with shaking hands. "I only gave her what she asked for," Elsie had said. Her sleeping draught, same as always. But same as always could mean so many things if a pinch more or less were added to the glass. Miss Marple rose and wandered to the window. The Dalrymple house was visible across the lane, its upper windows dark, the shutters drawn. Only one lamp still burned below, perhaps the maid sitting up, afraid to sleep. There was something tragically tender in the scene, the small house guarding its secret while the rest of the village gossiped itself to exhaustion. Already there were whispers. She took too much. She was frightened of that letter. She hadn't been well since she came home. Miss Marple knew better. Panic, poison, fear, they all wore the same face until one examined the smallest detail. The next morning, she visited the vicarage. Mrs. Clement, ever brisk and curious, poured tea and leaned forward eagerly. "Well, Jane, you've heard? The doctor says no definite poison. What a relief. Poor thing must have been overwrought." "Possibly," said Miss Marple, stirring her cup. "But distress doesn't brew valerian and digitalis together by mistake. It requires intention and a gentle hand." Mrs. Clement blinked. "Surely you don't mean someone meant to harm her?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, not harm, my dear. Help. Or at least that's what they told themselves. Murder rarely thinks of itself as wicked. It calls itself merciful, or practical, or kind." Mrs. Clement shivered. "You make it sound quite dreadful." Miss Marple looked toward the window, where the rain had begun again, steady and patient. "It is dreadful," she said softly, "because such things begin in compassion and end in silence. The world never sees the difference until it's too late." When she left the vicarage, the church bell tolled noon. The sound echoed through the wet air, solemn and slow. Miss Marple paused at the gate, her face thoughtful. If the doctor was right, the poison had been gentle, enough to calm, enough to slip past suspicion. It was a killer wrapped in comfort, a death that looked almost like care. She adjusted her hat and walked on toward the lane, murmuring, "Kindness can be deadly if given to the wrong end." Chapter 6. Threads of Deception. The maid stood in the small scullery, her apron clutched in both hands, eyes red from crying, or perhaps from the smoke that still lingered faintly in the air. Miss Marple, calm as ever, regarded the small iron grate in the corner. Its ash pan still held the faint ghost of burned paper, curled and fragile as moth wings. "I did as she said, miss," the girl whispered. "She told me to burn them all, every one. So they were old nonsense from abroad, and she didn't want them lying about. I didn't mean any harm." "Of course not," said Miss Marple kindly. "And when was that exactly?" "Just after tea, the day before the fête." She watched me do it, stood right there by the range. Seemed nervous, though, kept wringing her handkerchief and asking if the post had come. Miss Marple bent slightly, drawing the poker across the gray dust until a small blackened scrap fluttered free. She lifted it delicately with the tip of her knitting needle. "Ah," she murmured, "not entirely destroyed, then." The fragment was faintly singed, the ink blurred. Yet a line could still be made out. "Not your husband's fault." The rest was gone, swallowed by fire. Miss Marple studied it in silence, while the maid fidgeted, twisting the corner of her apron. "Please, ma'am," she said timidly. "You won't tell no one I burnt them? I thought I was helping her." She looked so tired. "I shan't scold you, my dear," said Miss Marple gently. "You did as you were asked, but one must always be careful with secrets. They rarely burn away as neatly as we'd like." She slipped the scrap into her handkerchief and looked toward the window. Beyond the garden wall, the orchard shimmered with late fruit and the slow hum of bees. The peacefulness of it made the words seem more sinister. "Not your husband's fault. Then whose?" That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the bit of paper beside her teacup, the memory of Mrs. Dalrymple's anxious eyes pressing at her thoughts. The village, she knew, loved nothing better than to retell its own stories. But some tales were quietly rewritten, sins softened by time. Mrs. Dalrymple had returned from abroad, widowed, wealthy, and faintly tragic. People had said her husband died in Cairo, that his business had been unfortunate. Yet now Miss Marple wondered if the misfortune had been moral rather than financial. She recalled what the vicar had confessed, that the woman sought forgiveness, but for what? Could it have been guilt over another man's ruin, or the shame of an old love never properly buried? The half-burned paper seemed to whisper its own accusation. If her husband was blameless, then perhaps she herself was not. And if she had destroyed the letters, it was not for modesty. It was for fear. A knock came at the door. Dr. Haydock entered, shaking the damp from his hat. "Still playing detective, Miss Marple?" he said with an amused smile. "Merely tidying the corners," she replied. "I've always believed untidiness in the past make for tragedy in the present." He laughed softly, but she saw the concern in his eyes. "Well, don't tire yourself. Some truths do more harm than good." Miss Marple looked back at the fire. The embers shifted, one small flame licking up and dying again. "Yes," she said, almost to herself, "but they never stay hidden. Even ashes tell tales if one knows how to listen." After he left, she rose and crossed to the hearth. The flames were low now, whispering faintly. She took up the tongs and turned one blackened scrap after another. Most were unreadable. Ink bled into gray, but one fragment held a single initial, H, written in a hurried scrawl. "H," she murmured. Not her husband, perhaps another entirely. Outside, thunder rumbled again, low and distant. The wind stirred through the orchard, sending a few early apples tumbling to the ground. Miss Marple watched the fire settle into its steady glow, her face thoughtful. Letters burned for fear, not for forgetfulness. And fear, she knew, had a peculiar way of lingering, smoke without flame, waiting to rise again. The next morning, a chill had settled over St. Mary Mead, and a fine mist clung to the hedgerows. Miss Marple had just finished her morning walk when she noticed a motor car at the edge of the village, engine running, tires glinting in the damp light. The man in the gray hat was inside, coat collar turned up against the drizzle, appearing ready to depart without a word. Miss Marple, as ever observant, approached with deliberate calm. "Good morning," she said, her tone gentle, almost as if greeting an old friend rather than a suspicious newcomer. The man turned, startled, his hat tilted back slightly, revealing sharp, restless eyes. "Good morning," he said, though there was tension in his voice. "I see you are planning to leave in such a hurry," Miss Marple continued, hands folded neatly in front of her. "Might I ask where your destination lies?" He hesitated, a flicker of unease passing across his features. I have business in London," he said carefully. Miss Marple tilted her head, knitting needle poised in her mind's eye. "Business, you say? And it coincides rather curiously with Mrs. Dalrymple's recent troubles and her passing. I wonder, is it only coincidence, or have matters of family required your attention here?" His jaw tightened, and he glanced at the car as if willing it to drive away without further conversation. Yet Miss Marple remained composed, serene in her manner, but persistent in the quiet way that disarmed most people. After a long pause, he spoke, almost in a whisper. "Very well. Perhaps you should know. I am not a solicitor, as I've claimed. I am her brother-in-law. A distant one, but family all the same." Miss Marple's expression remained calm, her voice soft but penetrating. "And the papers you sought, the reason for your sudden visit, were they important enough to justify secrecy?" "Yes," he admitted, shoulders slumping. "Some documents, letters, accounts, might have revealed scandals from years past. Certain mistakes and misjudgments that were never meant to see the light of day. I was asked to retrieve them before gossip and curiosity could unravel things further." Miss Marple nodded slowly, absorbing the information. So it was protection rather than legal duty that brought you. But did you consider the consequences of secrecy, of removing items without explanation? A village is observant, and even small changes set minds to wondering. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I did not intend harm. I meant only to prevent old family mistakes from causing fresh grief. But I see now that my actions have only drawn suspicion." Miss Marple allowed a small smile. Curiosity, after all, cannot be stopped by silence. People notice what is absent just as much as what is present. And in that noticing, stories, both true and imagined, begin to form. He nodded, the tension easing slightly. "I suppose you are right, Miss Marple. Perhaps I underestimated the reach of village eyes and ears." She gestured toward the lane. "Do go carefully. And remember, sometimes it is not the papers themselves, but the secrets we carry in our hearts that cause the most disturbance." The man hesitated at the roadside, glanced back once at the cottages tucked among the trees, then climbed into his car. Engines hummed, tires glinted again, and he was gone, leaving behind only the soft whisper of tires on wet lanes and a faint hint of damp leather. Miss Marple stood a moment, hands clasped, eyes thoughtful. The village had revealed its truths slowly, gently, yet decisively. And though one chapter had closed, the echoes of secrets, letters burned, locket found, confessions whispered, would linger, shaping the stories yet to come. She turned toward her own gate, breathing in the autumn air, satisfied with the knowledge that understanding, even when uncovered gently, always finds its way into quiet hearts. Chapter 7. The Night of Answers. The rain had returned in earnest that evening, sweeping along the lanes of St. Mary Mead and soaking the hedgerows in a glistening sheen. Miss Marple approached the vicarage under her black umbrella, the rhythmic tapping of raindrops keeping pace with her measured steps. The scent of damp earth and wet leaves mingled with the faint perfume of autumn roses, creating an atmosphere both comforting and tense. Mrs. Clement greeted her at the door, cheeks flushed from the warmth inside. "You're soaked," she exclaimed, ushering her into the study. "How can you be so fearless in this weather?" "Fear has little to do with rain, my dear," Miss Marple said lightly, shaking off her umbrella. "Curiosity, however, thrives under such conditions. The vicar stood nearby, hands clasped tightly, eyes betraying a trace of unease. Miss Marple, settling into her chair with her knitting, observed him closely, noting the subtle tension in his shoulders and the faint tremor in his fingers as he poured her a cup of tea. "Reverend," she began gently, "I've been thinking about the night Mrs. Dalrymple passed. There's a matter I wish to clarify, nothing accusatory, only understanding. You see, the doctor mentioned traces of a sedative. Perhaps you could enlighten me." He stiffened, swallowing nervously. "Ah, yes. I gave her a small bottle, only for her nerves. She had been unsettled since returning, and she feared sleepless nights. I would never intend harm." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Of course not. An act of care, then, intended to soothe rather than threaten. But it seems the effect was greater than you anticipated." He lowered his gaze, nodding. "I suppose so. Perhaps the combination of her own remedies or someone else's interference. I cannot be certain." "Understandable," she said, her voice gentle, even soothing. "Acts of kindness sometimes carry consequences unforeseen. The world rarely allows pure intentions to remain uncontaminated by circumstance." The vicar let out a long, quiet breath, as if the admission itself lightened a weight long carried. "I feared for her, Miss Marple, afraid she would not rest, and yet unwilling to impose too harshly. I gave her what I thought would help. And now," he trailed off, gaze fixed on the rain-slicked window pane. Miss Marple nodded, considering the situation. "Mercy and caution are delicate things. They require foresight, care, and, most of all, awareness of those around us. A well-intentioned hand can, by accident, guide someone toward misfortune if others intervene." He looked up at her, eyes reflecting both relief and lingering guilt. "You speak wisely as always. It has been a troubling time, one where every gesture seemed shadowed by uncertainty." She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice in the quiet intimacy of the study. "Sometimes the most profound mysteries arise not from malice, but from misunderstanding. And the person who seeks to help can unwittingly create peril if they do not consider the unseen influences at play." The vicar's expression softened further, and he nodded. "Yes, that is precisely it. There may have been another hand that evening, one I did not suspect, but whose presence was enough to turn a gentle act into tragedy." Miss Marple, her fingers lightly tracing the knitting in her lap, smiled faintly. "We may never know all that passed in that room while the house slept, but what we can discern is intention, and that, at least, guides our understanding." As the rain tapped softly against the windows, the room seemed to settle into quiet reflection. Even the ticking of the clock appeared gentle, measured, as though time itself paused to consider the delicate interplay of choice and consequence. When Miss Marple rose to leave, the vicar accompanied her to the door. "Thank you, Jane," he said quietly. "Your presence brings clarity where I find only doubt." "Not clarity, Reverend," she said kindly, "only perspective. And sometimes perspective is the greatest comfort one can offer." Outside, the rain had lessened to a soft drizzle, the village lights shimmering through the mist. Miss Marple adjusted her umbrella and walked slowly along the lane, thinking of the small bottle, the hand that administered it, and the unseen influence that had turned care into fatality. Some acts, she reflected, are too delicate to control entirely. And yet, understanding them, patiently, thoughtfully, was the only way to honor both intention and truth. The following morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to a soft, lingering mist that hung over the fields like a delicate veil. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting idly, yet her mind traced each movement from the night of the fête like threads running through a tapestry, each intersecting at crucial points. She reviewed the names of all who had entered the Dalrymple household: the maid, the vicar, Peter Halley, and even the distant shadow of the stranger in the gray hat. Each had a purpose, a motive, a small action that seemed trivial alone but gained weight in the pattern. She remembered Elsie, the nervous maid, carrying 2 small bottles, one of tonic, one of sedative, upstairs to Mrs. Dalrymple's room. Ordinarily, she would have known exactly which was which, but something had changed that night. Miss Marple recalled a fleeting glance she had caught between Elsie and young Peter Halley near the kitchen, Peter's expression mischievous yet anxious. The boy had meant no true harm, only to ensure that his minor theft of old papers went unnoticed, to hide his curiosity from the rest of the village. The puzzle pieces clicked slowly in Miss Marple's mind. In her gentle way, she began to trace the sequence. Elsie, persuaded by Peter's hurried insistence, swapped the bottles, mixing the calming tonic with a sedative intended for nerves. It was an act of obedience, influenced by fear of reprimand, rather than malice. She smiled faintly, not from amusement, but from a soft recognition of human frailty. The tragedy had not been hatred, nor revenge, nor greed. It had been an accident, born from a series of well-intentioned acts tangled with youthful misjudgment. Peter had meant only to sneak some papers unseen. Elsie had sought only to please her mistress, and the vicar had wished only to comfort. Yet in the delicate intersection of these simple intentions, disaster had quietly unfolded. Miss Marple rose and walked to the mantel, where the locket and the fragment of half-burned letters rested. She picked up the locket, turning it in her hands. Even the photograph of the unknown man, a fragment of past secrets, had been innocuous. It carried no threat. It was the small errors, the unconsidered actions of ordinary people that had proved fatal. Returning to her chair, she took out her notebook and carefully drew a diagram, marking each movement that evening: the path of the maid, the place of the vicar's visit, Peter's nervous darting through the kitchen, and the swapped bottles. The pattern emerged clearly, a tapestry of intention, care, and misunderstanding. Miss Marple reflected on the moral weight of her realization. Often, the world mistakes tragedy for malice. People want a villain, a shadow in the night, someone to blame. But the truth is quieter, softer, more human. A combination of fear, misunderstanding, and misplaced trust. In that, there was both sorrow and relief. No deliberate cruelty had taken Mrs. Dalrymple's life. It had been a gentle error magnified by circumstance. Later that day, she visited Elsie, not to reprimand, but to reassure. The maid's eyes widened as Miss Marple explained her understanding, her tone patient, warm, and without judgment. Relief washed over the girl's face, mingled with the grief of knowing her action, though innocent in intention, had contributed to the tragedy. Walking home through the misted lanes, Miss Marple considered the delicate balance of human action. Every small choice carries weight. Every kindness bears consequence, and every misstep, however minor, can ripple outward in ways no one anticipates. The night of the fête had been one of quiet disaster, not malice. Yet understanding, compassion, and careful reflection allowed the truth to rise gently, revealing the subtle threads of human error that had led to loss. Chapter 8. The Morning After. The morning sun rose gently over St. Mary Mead, scattering mist from the hedgerows and glinting off dew-laden rose petals. In the Dalrymple garden, Miss Marple stood beside Inspector Craddock, who shifted uneasily from foot to foot, his notebook tucked under one arm. The air smelled faintly of earth and lavender, carrying a soft sense of renewal that seemed at odds with the tragedy of the past week. "Inspector," Miss Marple began, her voice calm and steady, "there is no murder weapon, no act of malice. The death of Mrs. Dalrymple was the result of a series of small mistakes, compounded by well-meaning but misguided intentions." Craddock raised his eyebrows. "You mean no one did it deliberately?" "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "The sedative she received was intended to calm her nerves. The tonic was intended merely to soothe. Yet, through a combination of fear, misunderstanding, and haste, the two were mixed. The consequences were tragic, yes, but entirely unintentional." The inspector scribbled notes furiously, still struggling with the idea that such a high-profile death could be explained without a villain. "Now," Miss Marple continued, "we must speak with young Peter Halley. He was the final unintentional link in this chain of errors. Peter was found sitting on the garden bench, head bowed, fingers twisting nervously in his lap. His eyes widened as Miss Marple approached, and for a long moment he said nothing. "I know, Peter," she said gently. "It was not your fault, in the sense that you meant harm. But there was fear and curiosity, and perhaps a desire to protect yourself from discovery. It led to confusion and to Mrs. Dalrymple's passing." Tears welled in the boy's eyes. "I only wanted to take the papers. I never thought. I didn't know." "I understand," Miss Marple replied. "We all make mistakes, Peter, and sometimes the mistakes of the innocent have consequences we cannot imagine. But acknowledging them is the first step toward making peace." Inspector Craddock nodded slowly, his expression softened by the calm clarity Miss Marple exuded. "Well," he said, "I suppose the village will be relieved to know no one acted out of malice." By mid-morning, the news had spread quietly through St. Mary Mead. The villagers reacted not with outrage, but with a collective sigh, a mixture of relief, sorrow, and gentle empathy. They murmured among themselves as they tidied the fate's remnants, their conversations more reflective than accusatory. Miss Marple lingered in the garden, observing the roses, now glistening with dew. She noticed the subtle way the sunlight played upon the petals, each bloom a reminder of the resilience of life, even after error and tragedy. Later, she spoke with Peter privately. "The important thing, Peter," she said, "is to learn from what happened. Be honest, be careful, and never underestimate the weight of small actions. The world forgives those who recognize their own errors and strive to do better." The boy nodded, wiping his eyes, a sense of relief and understanding settling over him. The village, too, seemed to breathe easier, the tension of unanswered questions dissolving in the gentle morning light. As she walked home along the lane, Miss Marple reflected on the week's events. A death that was not murder, a village stirred by curiosity, and the delicate balance between intention and outcome. Sometimes, she thought, the most painful truths come wrapped not in vengeance, but in understanding and forgiveness. The air was soft, the roses fragrant, and St. Mary Mead, once again, seemed ready to face the day with quiet hearts and gentle smiles. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long golden rays over St. Mary Mead. The air had grown cooler, carrying with it the faint scent of fallen leaves and late-blooming roses. Miss Marple moved slowly among her garden beds, fingers brushing tenderly over petals glistening with dew. Each rose seemed to whisper a quiet story, a reminder that beauty and fragility often walk hand in hand. She paused by a particularly pale, pink bloom, turning it gently in her palm. "So many things happen quietly," she murmured to herself. "Evil seldom starts loudly. It begins as a whisper, And so too do kindness and care, sometimes saving more than harm can take. The events of the past week unfolded in her mind with gentle clarity. Mrs. Dalrymple's death, the confusion over the bottles, Peter's frightened actions, and the uncovering of old letters, all were part of a tapestry woven with care, error, and unintended consequences. There had been sorrow, yes, but also understanding. In the stillness of the garden, Miss Marple found the lessons hidden in these small tragedies, that attentiveness and empathy could untangle even the most tangled human missteps. A soft breeze rustled through the trees, sending a few petals fluttering to the ground. Miss Marple knelt to gather them, placing each fallen bloom in a neat pile. She thought of the village, where curiosity had sparked and whispers had stirred, yet peace had returned. Life, she reflected, always finds a rhythm after disruption, a way to settle into quiet continuity. The church bells tolled in the distance, their sound mellow and steady, marking the passage of time. Children's laughter began to thread through the village once more, mingling with the occasional bark of a dog and the low hum of farmers tending their fields. The world was moving forward, carrying its lessons gently, silently, with every small action and thoughtful choice. Miss Marple straightened, letting her gaze sweep over the garden. The roses would fade, as they always did, leaving behind seeds, stems, and memories of fragrance. So, too, the events of the week would become stories told softly, absorbed into the village's collective memory, carrying warnings and wisdom in equal measure. She paused by the gate, looking down the lane toward the cottages clustered under the elm trees. St. Mary Mead had resumed its tranquil rhythm. The storm had passed. The echoes lingered, but not in anger. Each petal that had fallen was a reminder, not of loss alone, but of endurance, resilience, and the gentle persistence of life. With a final sweep of her hand over the blooms, Miss Marple whispered to herself, "Even when tragedy touches us, life continues, quietly, softly, and beautifully. And if we listen, we learn what whispers can teach." The garden seemed to exhale with her, leaves shimmering faintly in the evening light, roses nodding as though in agreement. Peace had returned to the village, subtle and unshakable, yet the memory of the week lingered like a delicate perfume, carried in every corner of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple closed the gate behind her, the last golden light fading over the horizon. Life, death, error, and understanding all had their place, and all had left their lessons. She smiled softly, tucking her shawl about her shoulders, and began the slow walk home, every step echoing the quiet, enduring rhythm of the village she loved. As the sun sets over St. Mary Mead, the village breathes again in gentle calm. Secrets have been uncovered, lessons learned, and peace restored among the roses and winding lanes. Thank you so much for joining me on this quiet journey through mystery, curiosity, and human nature. I hope you felt both intrigued and comforted along the way. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts, favorite moments, or theories. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more cozy mysteries, whispered secrets, and tales that soothe while they captivate. Your support helps keep the stories coming and the mysteries unfolding. Until next time, may your evenings be peaceful, and may every whisper of a secret find a gentle resolution.